Okay. So yeah, I think we are pretty stable now, and
Okay.
so maybe we should go with the uh,
Okay.
basic questions. I know that one was a tricky one, and it actually was more advanced topic.
Well, whatever.
Yeah. So, what about the water? Water when you
Okay,
when
but
you
water for mead making, I don't know if that got through before. Basically, you don't want chloramines or chlorine, which are the two main sanitizers that industrial water suppliers put in most of the world. Activated charcoal filters will remove that. The only other thing that has caused some people a lot of trouble is using distilled or RO water, because there is no mineral balance of any sort left in there, and the yeast are kind of at a disadvantage as a result. So mead in general is not as sensitive to the water chemistry as brewing is.
did you say that using reverse osmosis water wasn't, or distilled water wasn't a good idea?
I have heard reports from a number of people where they said they had real problems in getting the fermentation to complete. And if you think about all the things brewers, worry about in their water, they want to get some calcium and some other things like that in the water, because the yeast need that. If you use just reverse osmosis water, you don't have any of that, and so the yeast are going to have to struggle. You could make up for it with the right kind of nutrients, but most people don't plan on doing that. So it's just easier to use water that has some minerals in it.
So we talked a little about. I think actually we didn't touch the honey. That it's actually the main ingredient of mead.
Right. Main fermentable. Might not be volume-wise the main ingredient.
Mm-hmm. So what types of honey are around?
Oh, wow. We could go on for a couple hours on that. It's pretty much any flower source that bees pollinate, there's honey from. The biggest thing I've heard from is that many of the apiaries in South America, the big producers of honey, don't think there's enough value in varietal honeys. And by varietal, I mean they came the majority from a single floral type. So they just blend it all together and sell it as wildflower honey. Well, that's fine. It works. But if you want to get that distinct flower source, you want the beekeeper to segregate their hives. Okay, this month they're getting that flower. Okay, separate out that honey. And some mead makers will pay a premium price to get that particular honey because of the flower source. And it's kind of, one of those things you have to do to develop the market. You got to train all those beekeepers that it's better to separate them and give you a choice.
So is there any advice on how we can try to train ourselves to be able to recognize different type of honeys?
Classic way is you just take like a little stick coffee stirrer kind of thing, and just taste the honeys. You want to smell them, you want to taste them. That's not quite what you're going to get in the mead, because as honey, it's extremely sweet. The aroma is slightly sweet no matter what, but you're going to get some of the floral character in the aroma. The harder part is to figure out what it's going to taste like once you strip most of the sugar out.
What do you think about diluting the honey with a little bit of water, maybe
You could
to...
probably do that. That would probably work. I mean, you don't need to make a whole lot, obviously, so it would be relatively simple to make up a little bit, because I don't think, if you were doing this for a group, I think if you made a shot glass of each one, nobody ever needs more than a few drops, I don't think.
And do you have any type of favorite for honey? Like I know
Uh,
some of us use vanilla, some of us use
yeah.
earthy.
The best reference for that is the honey flavor wheel that was developed at the University of California, Davis. It's, you've seen like the beer flavor wheel, and there's tons of these now. Milgard in the brewing world developed that and worked on it for his entire life. And ultimately, the people at UC Davis, which also has the experimental winery and the experimental brewery that do all kinds of research, they developed the honey flavor wheel, and they sell copies of it for not a lot of money. It's not available online because the few dollars they get per copy goes to pay for more research. And it's got, hundreds of descriptors on there. And it's
Cool.
just a really, interesting tool to use. I think I have a little piece of it shows up in my book, and they didn't want me to put the whole thing in there.
Wow. Well, for sure, it's something to watch and read and try
Yeah, and
to train
it's
ourselves.
got and it works like the beer flavor wheel. Closest to the center, you get broad descriptors, and as you work out on the wheel, you get more refined. And
Okay,
it has both positive and negative, descriptors, obviously.
so we know honey can have different types of colors as well, right?
Yep, and there's the national in the U.S. The National Honey Board has a whole system on how they rate the color of honeys. You can find them at the National Honey Board online, and they've got all kinds of parameters describing how you evaluate honey color. And for probably over 100 varieties of honey, you can find a description of that particular floral type of honey on their website. And they will even tell you which of their members might be selling it. But again, it's a US-based organization,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't help most of the people listening here unless somebody tries
Yeah,
to create a bigger deal. Shipping honey halfway across the world is really expensive.
and well, I'm for sure that in Chile it could be a very difficult process to introduce it in the country.
Yeah, I know
But
when I
it's
went down there, they confiscated the meal that they thought I had. They didn't notice the buckwheat honey because it didn't look like honey.
so. But anyway, it's good to know the procedures at least of
Yeah, and
maybe
like I
try
say,
to.
look at the National Honey Board. There's an amazing amount of resource there on how honey is characterized in the market, and what people treasure in terms of different types. I mean, it's unfortunate that, to my knowledge, there is no other non-US equivalent of that covers outside the US sources. But
Mhm.
many of the floral sources that are in there, you will find those same plants in Chile. They might have slight differences because of the soil or climate, but within the US, there's enough different ranges that it usually covers that in the description.
So do we have some kind of knowledge about chemical?
Yeah, there are papers out there that give really, really in-depth analysis of some of the honeys, various kinds of organic acids and really strange nutrients and everything that are in there. In general, what it comes down to is it's mostly sugar, though.
Do you think that it's possible to get some kind of lab analysis about the different types of flowers that could have been?
I'm not sure about the flowers. One of the really prolific mead makers I know, Carvin Wilson out of Arizona, who is like probably the biggest honey collector, if you could, on the planet. He has hundreds of varieties of honey he's collected for his mead making. And he buys them by those big white buckets, multiple at a time of each one. And he basically works with a couple of university labs. When he decides if he's going to buy some honey, he has them do an analysis of the honey and give him a report to find out if it's really what it's supposed to be. And so they'll do some quick analysis of, what kind of pollen is in it, and what kinds of sugars, and a few things like that, so that he has enough information to know if it's even worth buying. But it's not a cheap process. Last I heard, getting one of those tests done is about $100 US. So you don't want to do it unless you're talking about a significant amount of honey.
Wow. Yeah, for sure. That's very expensive. Okay, so just move on about in meat making related stuff. We know that there are some antique techniques in which
yeah.
in which the honey was boiled.
Yep.
What do you think about that? Now it's advisable to boil?
No good mead maker I know boils. With the exception, if they're making brochet, they may significantly heat the honey before they do anything else with it. But otherwise, nobody heats anything to make mead that I know of anymore.
And the brochet is
that's basically scorched honey.
Yeah, and it tastes like caramel, and
depending on how far you go, it might be worse than caramel.
Worse. Okay.
I don't recommend that, but caramel's okay.
I think I tried one of those a few
I'm
weeks
sure
ago.
You did. Now, it's not to say that commercial mead makers and home mead makers don't heat their honey a little bit. It's very common. It gets a little hard to pour, and so we might heat it to body temperature, a little warmer, to soften it up so it's easier to mix and stir. I mean, at a commercial level, if you're trying to move honey, say you have large containers of it and you have to pump it, you almost have to do something like that to get it to work well.
So, well, we know that boiling was mainly, the purpose of boiling was to be able to kill every kind of microorganism that was there.
Well, I don't think that was even probably where it started. I suspect it started that they're using the whole comb. If you think back to the old Viking era things, you found a honeycomb, you threw it in the pot, that killed all the bees, so they didn't sting you anymore.
Oh, wow.
And it separated the honey from the wax and the other debris.
Yep.
You skimmed that all off the top, made candles out of it, and you drank the other part.
Yeah, well, that for sure seems like a good reason to boil it.
Yeah, I don't really like getting stung by a few thousand angry bees.
So there is no need to be worried about microorganisms getting in between the fermentation?
There are microorganisms in the honey. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you do the right kind of lab tests, there are microorganisms, all kinds of them, wild yeast, fungus, you name it, bacteria, mildew, they're all in there. They can't function for very long in the honey because the sugar level is so high, they either go dormant or they rupture and die. The whole thing we're trying to do as mead makers is to put enough yeast in there with the right conditions that it overwhelms them all. And that's part of what you're doing with the nutrients, is you're trying to make sure the yeast has the best possible chance to take over and win the kingdom and make good mead for you.
Cool. So knowing that, let's talk about a little about the fermentation process. So,
okay,
what are the main challenges facing fermentation?
Keeping it cool enough and pitching enough yeast, first off. I would say, you don't, in general, most strains, there are a handful that tolerate really hot temperatures. That's a whole nother topic of discussion, like some of the Norwegian Quebec yeasts are able to ferment at, body temperature and hotter nowadays, but that's not a traditional mead yeast or traditional beer yeast, but I'm going to be playing with it later this week. Anyway, in general, you want to be able to keep the temperature cool rather than hot. Stay at the lower side of whatever's the recommended temperatures for your yeast strain. Pitch enough yeast. For most home and commercial mead makers, they are using dehydrated yeast, which at home makers is available in packets somewhere from 5 to probably 15 grams. Commercial level, they're using like half kilo bricks, but there are probably a couple hundred yeasts you can easily come up with if you look very hard that are from the wine side of the world, let us say, that might be usable in mead.
Mm-hmm. So diving a little bit deep on it, so what type of yeast would you use? Like we know that we can even use brewer yeast, but would you use brewer yeast? Would you use wine yeast or the specialty for mead?
Most of the yeast I use for my meads are actually wine yeast. There are very few yeasts that are commercially sold that are characterized as mead yeast. I mean, White Labs, Y yeast have a couple each, I think. But most of the people I know are using wine yeast, either dehydrated or there are a handful of them that are available in liquid form from Y yeast, White Labs, and some of the other vendors. But the vast majority of the wine yeasts are available in dehydrated form.
And what about the pitching rate? Is it normally the same pitching rate of an ale or a lager?
It's going to depend on the original gravity. I tend to use a website, batchbuilder.com. It's a fairly recent website, and it you enter in how many pounds of honey or kilos of honey and your batch size, and it tells you how many grams of dehydrated yeast you need. It's kind of really a handy gadget.
Batch Builder is
I think it's batchbuilder.com.
Okay.
Or just
Great.
Google for batch-builder.com, and it's a clever one. It'll also tell you what amount of nutrients. You can pick several different styles, and it tells you how much and when.
And you talk a little about the temperature of the fermentation. So,
I tend to try to stay most of the time at the lower limits of what an individual strain will tolerate. And vendors will publish, this is good from X to Y temperature. And so I'll try and stay really close to X. Okay. A really good source for that kind of information is a company called scottlabs.com. They produce every year a fermentation handbook. You can download it from their website as a PDF. It lists a ton of different strains that the California wine industry uses. It lists the, what range of temperature they want to work at, what kind of, in broad ranges. It also says what kind of nutrients does it want. Does it want low, medium, or high nutrients? Some things like that. It just is a really great source to collect information from. And you'll probably find that some winery down the street from you is already using all that information.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think about nutrients?
Nutrients are essential to my process. I start out, I'm using dehydrated yeast almost always. So I use Go Firm. Actually, I use a version called Go Firm Protect because that's the latest version. It was developed by Lallemand a number of years ago as an ingredient to improve the rehydration of dehydrated yeast, because they sell rehydrated or dehydrated yeast. And so they tell you you want 1.25 times the weight of the dehydrated yeast. You mix it into water at 104 degrees, or actually you want it at 104 when you put the yeast in, and I mix it a little hotter because it doesn't dissolve well at 104. I'm talking Fahrenheit.
Mm-hmm.
And then I let it cool down to 104. Then I mix the yeast in. I set a timer 15, 20 minutes. Let it sit. After that, the yeast I stir it up. It's all suspended, and I dump it into the fermenter with all the other stuff that's ready. And the GoFirm's purpose is to make sure that the majority of the cells survive the rehydration process and are ready to immediately go to work when they get to the sugar and the mead.
So that mead making, it's a fairly fast process. I mean,
yes, because
in comparison with beer
there's
making?
no hot side. So you're mixing sugar, water, and maybe some other stuff, fruit juice, whatever, some spices. And then you rehydrate the yeast, you dump it in, and you're now ready. And if you're putting the right amount of yeast in and it's ready because you rehydrated it with GoFirm, it's probably going to be bubbling in less than 12 hours.
That's a very short
yeah, even if it takes a day, that's still pretty fast, because I can make a lot of batches in an afternoon. I run out of fermenters.
Nice. So we talked before a little about the way to add nutrients.
Right. So nutrients, in my book, I talk about adding in quarters. You add a quarter at the start and a quarter in 2 days and 4 days and 6 days, whatever. Things have evolved a little bit based on more research and more literature. What I'm tending to do nowadays, and you'll see that with the batch builder thing, the typical approach is I rehydrate the yeast with GoFirm. Always did that. Dump that in. Well, the modern theory is that's already got some nutrients there. The yeast are going to use that up in the first handful of hours. So 24 hours later, I add a third of the nutrients. And then in another 24 hours or so, I add another third. And the last third I add when at least a third of the sugar is gone. And it will tell you, if you look at that batch builder thing, it tells you all these things, when to put it in. And it allows you to pick by a couple of buttons you can click on which blend of nutrients you're going to use.
Yeah, actually, I think I have used that one before.
And it's interesting. One of the things that's in newer research than from when my book was written, it's sad to say my book came out in 2014. So I finished writing it in the fall of 2013. Doesn't seem like that should be that long ago, but some things have changed. So my book used Fermaid K and DAP, diammonium phosphate. And the more recent research is once the alcohol gets up a little ways, I think it's around 8% ABV, yeast is no longer able to metabolize diammonium phosphate. It becomes nearly toxic to them.
Oh.
So you don't want to be adding Fermaid K or DAP after the alcohol level gets to about that point. So you'll see people talking about using Fermaid O. Well, the part of what's happened there is Fermaid O is organic. Well, okay. The big difference is between Fermaid O and Fermaid K, and these are both Lallemand products. There's some other Fermaids and other letters after them, but K was the long-term one a lot of us mead makers used. O is very similar, except K has DAP as one of its components, and O does not. And that's so that you can add ferment O later in the process without adding DAP that's bad for the yeast.
Okay, I see. So, what do you normally use? Do you stay?
You can use ferment K or ferment O early in the process. It won't matter. And in that little online calculator will, if you click that I want to use, one or the other or a combination, it will tell you the schedule of one to put them in, but it will never tell you to put DAP or ferment K in late in the process because that's bad for the yeast now. So I bought several kilos of ferment K some time ago. And when you're only using 20, 30 grams at a time, it takes a long time to use that up. So I use that in the first part of my batch. In the latter part of the batch, when I can't use the DAP anymore, I'm using ferment O.
So during the fermentation, we know that for sure nutrient addition, it's very important to make it clean.
Right.
And temperature has a lot of it has a huge impact as well. So what do you aim? Like, do you aim for a clean fermentation or for a more estery one?
It depends on what you're trying to make. And again, you can play this game by not torturing your yeast, or by just picking a different yeast strain. So there's many ways to go about this. Most of the mead makers I know sort of adopt a handful of strains that they kind of really like. And so probably the majority of their batches are made with one or two strains. And the rest they experiment because they're trying to get some unique character. And some people I know go to the extreme of they ferment part of the batch with one strain and part of it with another, and then blend it to get the flavor they want. Those are the people that win a lot of medals.
Yeah. So the wine yeast normally is, in comparison with brewer yeast, is cleaner, or
it's not necessarily cleaner. It's just different. I mean, wine yeast is, most of them are most like an ale yeast, I guess. Most like. But they're different in their nutrition needs and what they're going to do, and probably in their alcohol tolerance. Most wine yeasts are going to go 13, 14, 18, whatever percent, depending on the situation. Generally, because as mead makers, we're giving them proper nutrition, we're going to be at the upper side or beyond of their advertised alcohol limit.
have you heard about 20% mead alcohol?
Oh yeah, they're generally a little rough. You're getting up there pretty bad there. I've made some. I think I have a sizer on tap that's 18 or some ungodly thing like that.
And we have a quick question about using lager yeast.
You can do that. It's just fine. I mean, obviously, if you want it to be crisp and lager-like, you're going to have to ferment at lager temperatures. And if you're prepared to do that, there's no reason not to. You just got to make sure you pitch enough. The guiding rule from the beer world is you need about twice as many cells at lager temperature as you do for ale. So that means you need a lot of yeast. And maybe somewhere along in the past, I've done a lager mead. Nowadays, you can get some pretty good lager dried strains, so it's not so hard to do.
So would you advise to make a starter for some of those yeast? And if you
Well, you could. If you're using liquid yeast, I'd use a starter.
Extract?
Yeah, that would be fine. I mean, you're just growing yeast. It doesn't matter. But I almost never make a starter for meads. It's been years. I'm almost always using a dehydrated yeast. And so why would I make a starter? Take the risk of more infection versus just buying another package if I need more cells.
Actually, wine yeast it's cheaper than brewer yeast.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's really cheap. I don't know quite why they price it that way. Because beer yeast dehydrated, they charge way more money for.
Yep, not almost 10 times as much. So what about the degassing, the fermentation?
What about the what?
Degassing?
Oh, and that was, again, part of the thing we talked about. Most of us did when my book was written. And the current thinking is it's not really necessary. I don't do it anymore. You can. It won't hurt anything. It's just mostly unnecessary. I mean, you think about it, if you have a big tank and a big meadery or brewery, it's really hard to do. And so at scale,
so
people weren't doing it. It becomes really messy.
It has some very big implications in the oxygenation.
Yeah, well, and
rate.
so, and many people I know will, they'll have an oxygen stone in the fermenter and they'll pump some more oxygen in. But that's much easier to accomplish than trying to stir it and de-aerate it. And I haven't seen anything from anybody since this kind of hit in the last year that really indicated any reason why you had to do that. It's like it made no sense, so I quit doing it.
So I think it was as well for a purpose of the when you were trying to add the nutrients.
Yes, it definitely helps for that. And so what you can do if you're not de-aerating the batch or CO2ing the batch, and you're going to put some powdered nutrients in, pull a little bit of the batch out, put it in a small sanitary container, stir it in there to get all the bubbles out. Now it's liquid, it's wet. You can dump it into the big batch and you won't have a big foam problem.
Oh, okay. So good to know, because
Otherwise,
everything you say, it's like,
well, the big
making meat, it's getting easier and easier.
Well, the big horror story in the commercial brewing world is, the green snake coming out of the fermenter when you dump, half a truckload of green hop pellets into the dry hop chute, and everything comes out at you.
So let's a bit further in the oxygenation rate. So it would be just mixing, stirring, using the degassing wand, I think.
Yeah, and I do that for the start of the batch. And, I'm mixing pretty hard because I want to get it mixed up, and it takes a little while. And I do have an oxygen cylinder, so I can hit it with oxygen when I think of it in time. Typically, I'm going, oh, crap, I haven't sanitized it yet. And it hasn't really made I haven't noticed any big difference between, and I haven't done side-by-side true science here, but I haven't noticed a difference between when I did add oxygen to a batch and when I just stirred it and didn't add oxygen.
Okay.
And if I was doing this at a large scale, like Michael Fairbrother at Moonlight did, maybe it would matter and I'd care a lot more.
Would you care about, I don't know, making a sack mead, homebrew?
It'd be a little more important
scale?
There, yeah. It would be a little more important there.
Because normally when you were making a sack, you were adding nutrients at the second day, at the fourth day, and every time you were adding some oxygen.
I still have several additions if I'm making one of those. There's no doubt about it. And the other thing is that's still got to go on. If you're putting whole fruit in one of these, you still have to, keep push. As the winemakers say, you have to do a punch down. You have to push the fruit below the liquid level, in theory, multiple times a day. And so you're doing some stirring no matter what if you have whole fruit in there.
Mm-hmm. So Just to wrap up a little bit about that, degassing seems no longer to be necessary.
Yeah, I think it's falling off the concern area anyway, and the leading edge people have given up on it, let's say.
Okay. So the other big question is about stabilization and sweet meats. Like we know
Okay.
that nearly almost every meat is going to end dry.
Yep, unless it's really big sack meat, there's pretty much no other option. So stabilization, there's a really neat spreadsheet on the Facebook American Meat Maker Association webpage in the file section, which you can only get to if you're a member. But one of the guys put together a really nice spreadsheet that allows you to, see a nice chart of where you have to be and calculate. So the parameters are the pH and the alcohol level. You can figure out your alcohol level from your starting gravity and your finished gravity, measure the pH, and that tells you how much SO2 you need to have in the mead to be stable. So first you have to add enough SO2 to get to that level. And then
sorry, what would SO2 stand for?
Sulfur dioxide.
Okay.
And then the second thing you have to do is, and the spreadsheet tells you this as well, it tells you how much potassium sorbate you need in grams per liter in both cases. And you put those in. I'm old school. I tend to think that I put the sulfate in today and tomorrow I'll put the sorbate in on the assumption that the sodium dioxide will take a while to work. Maybe not. And it basically just slows the yeast down. And then I add the sorbate, and the sorbate prevents any new yeast from occurring and slows down the fermentation by that process. So now, once I've added the sodium dioxide and added the sorbate, then I can sweeten it to my choice, wherever I want.
And what about the yeast that could be added in the meat, in the sweetening?
You can't add
in the sweetening honey.
You don't, well, within reason, anything that's in any honey you use to back sweeten it with is not going to be able to ferment, because between the SO2 and the sorbate, the microorganisms and the yeast are inhibited from restarting fermentation. And that's why you do those first before you add the sweetening. The sweetening could be from apple juice or honey or whatever. It doesn't matter. Those two ingredients you put in beforehand keep the fermentation from restarting.
Great. And would you use any fining agent as well?
You could. If you're going to do fining, you probably want to fine before you do the SO2 and the sorbate. The rationale there is you want to get as much yeast out as you can. The SO2 and the sorbate only, between them are going to keep the microorganisms, the non-yeast, and the yeast that is present from doing anything new, in the sense that the sorbate keeps the yeast from reproducing to make new baby cells, and the SO2 keeps all the other nasties away. So if you had a lot of yeast still in the fermenter and you added those two and then you sweetened it, those yeast cells that are still there could ferment until they died. So you want to get as many out, and that's why you might want to fine or filter before you did this process.
Cool. So just for wrapping up again, for making a sweet meat, it's advisable to just stabilize first and then add some raw honey.
Well, you would fine, stabilize, add honey. Now, if that honey made it cloudy, and it might not. Kind of depends on luck and what kind of honey. You might have to find a second time.
Some people have talked that maybe using oak chips, they tend to help to clarify.
They might, but that's not a real given. I mean, oak chips inherently aren't supposed to do that. You might get a little action from them falling to the bottom, but the big thing that oak chips are used for is they add tannin. Tannin isn't normally seen as a major clarifier.
Okay, so actually we are touching that not stabilization. We are talking now a little about balance. That we know that we need to try to balance acidity, tannins, sweetness, and alcohol.
Yeah, it's a really, and there is a good description of balance in the well, I guess it's no more than a year old BJCP cider study guide. It has a different beverage but same problems. Talks a lot about how balance works, and it's the sweetness, the alcohol, the tannin, all those things play a role, and it's much more complex than balancing a beer.
What types of acids would you use if you need to balance?
That's hard because the acid choice might depend on the other ingredients. So if I made a piment with grape juice in it, i.e. is the fruit, then I would probably use tartaric acid because tartaric is derived from grapes. And so that's the acid that grapes would provide. So if I need acid in a piment, I'm going to use tartaric because it's just, it mimics what the grapes would provide. It's kind of my go-to for most meads anyway. But if I use a fruit that brought a lot of citric, say a lot of citrus type fruits, then I might use citric acid. So it kind of depends on the situation. Malic is the dominant fruit in apples, for example, and there's a few other fruits that also have that information. So you kind of want to pay attention. You can find the tables online of, for most well-known fruits, what the dominant acid is. And so if you use that fruit in your mead, that's probably the acid you want to use if you want to add acidity. Because otherwise it's going to come across as being foreign. It's going to come across as fake.
Would you use grape skin to add some tannins?
You could do that. There's a whole real long topic you could have with some of the modern mead makers. Again, going back to Scott Labs, there's a whole section in their fermentation handbook on pre-fermentation and post-fermentation tannins. They have more than a dozen products that are ways to add tannins at different times in beverages. And they'll provide guidance. Well, if you add this one, you should wait, 3 weeks or whatever before packaging for it to settle out and balance. It's worth reading that stuff. There's no one choice anymore for tannin. I've been using some of their pre-fermentation tannins in a lot of my recent mead batches. And they have ones that are, from the wine world developed for white wines, and they have another series that were developed for red wines.
So a lot of different choices there.
Yeah, and you don't need a lot. I mean, we're talking just a small number of grams of this stuff in a 20-liter batch.
Yep. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little about adding fruits and spices.
Okay, I almost always add my fruit in primary. A couple of reasons for that. fruit is mostly water, with the exception of a couple oddball ones like dates. On average, most fruits serve by weight about 85% water. Most fruits are also by weight 5% or less sugar. And the rest is gunk that's left over at the end that sits at the bottom, and well, it's organic, but whatever, it has no value to us. Or it has some really impressive flavors. So if I'm going to put fruit in there, I'm going to get a lot of water. So if I put fruit in later, say after I stabilize it, I'm diluting my mead to the point where my stabilization might not work and it could still restart fermentation because I diluted it. Because I remember I said I used that spreadsheet and it calculated I needed at this pH and this alcohol level, I needed this much SO2 and this much sorbate. Well, if I had fruit and it's 85% water, I've changed the gravity, the alcohol level, and therefore that stabilization doesn't work anymore. So you don't want to get yourself in that position. You want that water taken into account up front. And that little bit of sugar, unfortunately, a little bit of sugar that the fruit brings you, minor, but let that ferment. And while there's not a lot of people talking about it, like there are in the brewing world, and in the beer world, people are talking a lot about biotransformation of the various chemicals in the hop plants and how fermentation changes them. Well, I think the same thing happens with fruit in a mead. So if I put my fruit in primary and it's there while the yeast are able to work on it, it's transforming some of those compounds into other more pleasant characteristics to me. And so I almost always put the fruits in my primary fermentation. If they're big, messy things like plums and currants or raspberries or whatever, I put them in a big mesh bag. So I can easily remove them when I want to stir it. And, it's also easy to push them under the surface of the liquid. It just works better.
What's the thing with the fruit skin? Do we need to peel them off?
I never do. It's way too much work.
What about apples, for example?
And nobody that makes hard cider in the U.S., we call it, in the rest of the world, they call it cider, peels the apples. The skins on apples have the tannin. The pulp has none. So a number of years ago, I was talking to a guy I've known for years who has a really good meadery in Wisconsin. I served some of this mead, in fact, when I was in Santiago a couple of years ago. The White Winter meads you guys had, if you remember those. Well, John makes a strawberry mead. John lives in a place in Wisconsin that has miles and miles and miles and miles of strawberry plants. And so when he goes to make commercially a strawberry mead, there's truckloads of strawberries coming in. And I was whining to him about how, it was such a pain having to cut all the green, end off the strawberry to, get them ready to ferment. He says, don't worry about it. Just throw them in. So we can't do that. I mean, obviously, we can't cut the green part off of 100 billion strawberries or whatever they're using. So that's what I did the next time. And he was right. You can't tell the difference. You want them to be clean.
But do you need to crush them at least?
For strawberries, you don't. They're soft. And apples, you wouldn't have to, but it'd take a long time for them to break down. I live in a part of the world, and I know you do, Gustavo, as well, now that you're in Seattle, where apples grow everywhere, and the orchards in the fall have massive quantities of apple juice. And my homebrew club buys what they call totes, those plastic containers in a big stainless steel cage that you need a forklift lift to move. We buy multiple of those in the fall, and as a club project, we ferment, 50,000 liters or something. It's a scary amount we buy, and it's just the crushed apples, and these places do it for business. They grind them up and press them and sell us the juice. It's not clarified. It's just sugar water with apple flavor.
So, like, for example, if I want to make some kind of blackberry or blueberry mead, do I need to froze them up and then?
I typically, it's mainly because of my timing thing, but I almost always freeze the fruit before I use it. It has an advantage because it breaks down the cells, so they're gonna break down faster. But it's also just because I'm not ready to make the batch the day I buy 50 pounds of blueberries. And so it gives me a little time until I'm ready, and then I throw it in.
So it's something about practical standpoint.
Yeah. And the other thing is, for some of those fruits, at least when you're in North America, you can buy those fruits in a juice format. Black currants, blueberries, raspberries, a whole bunch of those are available as fruit concentrate. And the typical suppliers are selling like it's an 8-to-1 reduction. So if you buy a quart jug, or a liter jug, it's the equivalent of 8 liters of juice, which you figure that's a lot of pounds of fruit.
It is.
And it doesn't take much space to store that, is the value of it.
And it would be just add that concentrate in the primary fermentation?
I just add it in the primary. And of course, since they've reduced it all down, you can reverse the math. Okay, so I got a liter of it, and maybe it weighs 1.5 kilos. Okay, so it's an 8-to-1, so that means it's 8 times whatever its weight is what the raw fruit was before they did it. And then, it's 8. If it's 8-to-1 reduction, so it multiplied by 8, that's the volume. Okay, that's the liquid they squeezed out of the fruit. If it's 85% a liquid, that's what it is. You can divide by 0.85 and you get, that's equivalent to how many pounds of fruit it is. And you go, ooh, that's a lot of fruit. Uh-huh. And there's no solids, there's no skins, there's nothing. They just, they did the magic. It's
so if you would use solid berries, do you need to crush them? I insist. It seems very.
No, I cannot think of a single berry I've ever crushed. In fact, the only fruit I've ever used that was crushed was apples.
Wow.
Even pears. I've used pears, and I just halved them and threw them in the fermenter.
Not even shove them?
Nope. I washed them, and I cut them in half, and I threw them all in.
Well, good to know. It's getting easier.
Yes.
And easier.
Next thing you know, you're making 3 batches yet tonight.
Actually, I have a few pounds of honey.
Well, there you go. I have a couple buckets.
So, well, we talked a little about fruit. What about spices? So, would you normally make a tincture of them?
I might. It depends on on the levels. Typically, if I've used the spice before and I have a feel for how it works, I might put a little in the fermentation, and then I'd make a tincture to adjust it later. So I made a goofy one this last fall. I made a pumpkin pie spiced mead, and I actually used canned pumpkin in it. Didn't add anything to the mead, but whatever. And so I was afraid that if I used the same spicing level as a real pie recipe did, it'd be too spicy. So I cut it way down, and then I put the rest in a tincture, and then I just added from the tincture to get it to the flavor I wanted when it was done. And that worked pretty good.
So do you have any type of recipe to make the tincture? Would you normally use vodka or?
I typically use vodka just because, it's cheap. And so I'll just put enough in to cover the spices to get some liquid. Because you're just gonna, I just gonna use the medicine dropper, and I'll do a precisely measured sample in a glass. Like, okay, yeah, 1 drop's not enough, and I do another glass next to it with 2, and another with 3, and okay, yeah, okay, 4 is too much. Okay, let's increase the size, and I try and hone in on whatever, because I put a lot of spice in the vodka, so it's pretty intense. I don't need much generally. I even use that with oak cubes if I'm trying to get just a slight oaky character into a mead. It also gives you some tannin at the same time.
Cool. So, what types of spices work well with tinctures?
Almost all of them, when I think about it. I've used allspice, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mint. Surprisingly, mint tends to be pretty bulky, so you need a lot of vodka to do it.
And normally, how many times does it take to create tincture?
Oh, it doesn't take very long. Usually, it's going to extract in a few days. Probably
Okay.
goes faster than that, but I don't check it before that.
A week would be all right?
Oh, a week is almost always plenty. I mean,
Perfect.
the thing to be aware of when you're doing a tincture is spices extract differently in different ingredients. So, for example, if you're cooking something, you frequently become aware, if you wanted to be a high-end chef, that some spices extract better in fat, i.e. meat fat, when you're cooking the meat, than they do in water or alcohol or sugar water. And it may be that some aspect of the spice comes out better in one solution than it does in another. So you might have to pay attention to that. Most tinctures, I make I use vodka because vodka is stable. It's not going to spoil. You can do a tincture in water. It's just that you have to watch out because bacteria is probably going to grow in it. You could do it in cooking oil and you get a different result on some spices. The problem is that now you got to put cooking oil in your meat and you got to separate the oil off the top. I mean, one of the weirdest tinctures I heard of is from a small commercial brewery friend was telling me, well, yeah, they had some friend asked them to make some bacon beer for a bacon festival they were having.
Wow. People go
So
crazy.
their solution to that was they bought a few pounds of really good bacon, cooked it really well, ate the bacon, kept all the bacon fat out of the pan they cooked it in, and just dumped it into a big glass jug and covered it with beer. Let it set for a few days. All the bacon fat / lard floats to the top. Skim that off, and then they dump the rest of the beer into the keg. That was apparently turned out the best bacon beer they'd ever made.
Wow.
Of course, it's illegal as a commercial producer in the U.S. for them to do that because they violated several TTB rules, but that's beside the point.
So normally you would use the tincture after fermentation, right?
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
before bottling?
Yeah, something like that. And sometimes, unfortunately, what can happen is you add these tinctures and you may find that it's going to change over time. What's happening is as you're doing all this messing around, measuring these things in and, collecting samples and, shaking them up, you're introducing oxygen and it's going to take it a while to restabilize. And so it may take it a week or two to get back until it's ready to be used. Now, if you talk to people in the wine world, they talk about bottling shock, processing shock, because you're shaking it up, moving it around, stirring it, and it takes it a while to recover. So when you sample it when you're doing this, it might not be as good as it's going to get.
Great. So I think we are reaching to the end of the questions. We still have a few of them that are a
Okay.
bit more advanced or experimental.
Okay, it seems to be working better as people are dropping off, unfortunately.
Yeah. And it's been very fun. A lot of good information. Yeah, well, actually, somebody is asking about other Jesus strain, and that was the question that I was going to ask.
Sure. Probably the most out there strain that people are experimenting with in the last year and a half is the Quebec, the really goofy stuff from Norway that can ferment at well above body temperature, and people are saying, well, you can do some of these and fermentation's over in 18 hours.
Yep.
So you have to be really careful when you're going to add your nutrients because you can't come back tomorrow. It's done.
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably the most out there. Brett works. Obviously, Brett is a very good primary fermenter, and you get different characteristics out of Brett if you use it as a primary ingredient versus a mixed. And I know that from making mixed fermentation beers. So if I make a beer with pure Brett, it's very different than when I fermented with Saccharomyces and then add some Brett late in the fermentation. It doesn't get near as funky if it's the primary fermenter. But it's all about paying attention to what characteristics those fermenting organisms are going to give. So if there's one that's known to throw tropical fruit notes, that to me is kind of like an automatic, okay, well, if I'm going to put pineapples and guavas and whatever else in the mead, then why wouldn't I use Brett and some Saccharomyces to make that? Because I want to emphasize the pineapple.
Yep, for sure.
But if I was trying to make a straight orange blossom honey mead, that's probably a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. You would lose the fragrancy, perfumey.
So that's why I say that mead's got such a wide open place to play with all these things. I mean, you have way more freedom to try different characteristics than any other fermented beverage. So probably partially because people aren't familiar with it, but
what about we have a few questions that the audience is asking about how would you naturally carbonate your mead for one sparkling, or
you can only do that. Well, let's see. There's two ways you can do that. So if it fermented bone dry, because the original gravity, i.e., the alcohol level, is not sufficient that the yeast has reached its limit, and you want to make a bottle conditioned beverage, you're going to have to make a dry bottle conditioned beverage because you won't be able to stabilize. You can't stabilize it, sweeten it, and then bottle condition. That's just not possible. You put those stabilizers in so that the yeast can't ferment it. If you try to add more yeast so that it would bottle condition, it would explode. So those conditions aren't conducive to making a sweet bottle conditioned beverage. Conversely, you could go the route of a bottle conditioned sack mead. And that case, you have to have it so big that it almost ferments out before you bottle it, and you bottle it at the right time, and now it's reached its limit, it shuts down. So bottle conditioning meads is a lot harder because generally the yeast you're using, the alcohol limit, where they're going to shut down is way beyond what you're trying to make.
Yep.
And so if you want sweet and bottle condition, they don't get along well. Dry and bottle conditions, no problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is that you would need to be very careful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they call those glass grenades.
Uh-huh. So, well, sweeteners for back sweetening? I mean,
If you're not putting a lot of sweetness in, you will get a little character from the honey. There's no doubt about it. And I know people that have actually done quite well with this, where they use a cheaper honey, say orange blossom or clover, that are, widely available, make the mead, and then they back sweeten with a rarer honey, say quince or Tupelo or something like that. That's a much rarer honey, and they only use that to back sweeten, and that adds a lot of aroma to the mead that the original honey didn't provide.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one approach. The other approach is, well, you just use the good honey all along of whatever kind you're making, orange blossom, whatever, and you don't really care. If you used all orange blossom and you want it to come across as orange blossom, you're not adding so much honey usually that when you're back sweetening, that you could almost just use table sugar. It's all fermentable and it's all sweet. And if you used a lot of good honey in the early part of the batch, you aren't going to notice a lot of difference. But it's kind of your call. And like I said, people are playing the game of, well, I made a cheap clover mead, because clover is the single widest made honey in North America, and then I back sweeten with whatever I wanted to come across, and it will fool the majority of the people. They'll think it's 100% that honey.
If you would make that, I mean, mixing the different types of honey just because of the back sweetening, would it be necessary to declare it?
It's all about what you're going to get. I mean, there's no hard and cast in concrete rules. I only declare things if they're apparent.
Okay, yeah. That's
now, if I'm trying to play this game to make it come across as quince blossom, and I mostly use clover, and I just back sweeten with quince, then I'm going to call it a quince blossom, probably.
Yeah. And I think we have just two more experimental questions. What about the use of unusual goods?
Unusual goods.
Goods like, I don't know if would it be the name here, but others rather than oak.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of stuff people are doing with other ingredients like that, other than woods, other than oak wood. In the US and in Minnesota, where I live, in fact, there are two big suppliers. Barrel Mill and Black Swan are both within a few hours of my house, and they make things called spirals and what's the other term they use? Honeycomb. So they're pieces of all kinds of unusual woods, for example, that may or may not be toasted at different barrel kind of things. So I've used maple wood, and they have sassafras and all kinds of unusual woods. They've done, it's called Spanish cedar, which is technically a mahogany. That's actually been used commercially by Cigar City in Florida. They've done various citrus woods, all kinds of them. And since they have they have machines that basically cut these into a spiral, and their original customer base was the commercial wineries. You tie a piece of dental floss or plastic string on, and you dip it into the barrel, and you leave it in the number of days to get your flavor, and then you pull it back out. Well, they make versions of these that'll fit into a glass carboy as well, and they have dozens of varieties of wood that you can use for this. And I've talked to the guy at the company, says, well, a lot of these woods we can't make barrels out of. They won't hold water, but they taste good.
Would it work to make a tincture of those as well?
Yes, it would. I mean, you might get a slightly different extracting it in vodka than you might by dipping it into the barrel with your active meat in it. I've done both. and you can have fun. The thing you have to watch out for is going too far.
Yep. Well, think we have reached to the last question.
Oh.
What about sour meats?
You could do that. It's very possible. Obviously, Brett and Saccharomyces aren't going to get you very sour, but you could do lacto. You could do the classic kettle sour, Catarina sour kind of technique. I mean, hold it at around body temperature with some lactose strain to sour it, and then you would have to heat it to kill the lactose strain off. And then you could ferment it with a clean yeast strain. It's very doable. It works well with a number of tropical fruits. There's no reason you couldn't do that.
And what do you think about the balance? Making
Well,
sour?
balance is relative. So you're trying to make a sour product. So obviously, it's not going to appeal to people that don't like sour.
Of course.
But so that's where it's a perception thing. So if you like sour, it's pretty good, and you understand that the balance is definitely exaggerated towards the sour side. My perception of a lot of the Catarina sours and some of the kettle sours, which are very similar, they're pretty one-dimensional sour with a little bit of fruit flavor. I like them, but they're very simple sours when I compare them to, say, a lambic. You could do the same process that the lambic brewers do to a mead, but that's a multi-year process. I've made lambics, and it takes years.
Well, that seems like a very nice experiment to do.
Yeah, I have not done it to mead. I could try that. Like I said, I have made a mead IPA.
Oh yeah, how was it?
That was very good, I thought, but I did it basically to rub it in Gordon Strong's eye. It's like, well, okay, you had black IPA, white IPA, hazy IPA. Okay, well, here's mead IPA.
So it seems like since I said a few times that we have reached the end of our questions, a few other people have asked for last ones. Do you have enough time to address a few of them?
No problem.
So since you were speaking about that mead IPA, I think if I recall correctly, that was a session one.
It was about a 6.5%.
6.5? That seems pretty session for a mead, right?
Yeah, well, for mead, yeah. It was an IPA strength alcohol.
Yeah. So, any advice for session meats? Normally, they are very quick.
They're quick. You almost always have to stabilize and back sweeten. Nobody wants a 6.5% dry mead, or at least not very much of it. That's the problem with. There's really no yeast strain out there that conks out at 6.5% or less.
Normally, they would lack of honey presence and complexity.
Well, they wouldn't have as much honey presence. There's no doubt about that because they're smaller, and a good judge would know that. But again, you ferment it down to 5 or whatever your session strength is. You stabilize it, and you're going to back sweeten it a little bit, and so that's going to give you some more honey presence. I mean, you could also play some games with some other more unfermentable sugars to add body. They're not going to give you honey presence, but I did this with my pumpkin chiffon pie mead I made last fall. I added maltodextrin and lactose to it.
Wow.
So I added body and not real pronounced sweetness, but it gave it more mouthfeel, kind of more mimic the real dessert.
That's something that actually I think we didn't talk a lot. Adding more mouthfeel, because
Yeah,
normally honey doesn't have that much protein to help in the mouthfeel.
right. It all gets fermented away, what little it has, because it's just sugar.
That normally you would add some more structure and complexity using some
Yeah,
kind
right.
of wood.
Tannins and yeah.
Yeah. So what about bitter mead, using hops for bitterness?
Well, like I said, I made the IPA mead, and in that case, I looked at my IPA recipe that had won some medals. So I said, okay, original gravity was whatever. Subtract the final gravity from that. I made a mead that strong, fermented bone dry. I stabilized it. I back sweetened it. Then I dry hopped it like the mead with the same exact. I mean, the real IPA, just like, same timing, same temperatures. And then at the end, I bought isomerized hop extract, which is pre-bittered. So you don't have to boil it. And they tell you, well, you put, 1 milliliter of this stuff per liter will give you this many IBUs. And it's like, okay, I wanted 55 IBUs. It's measured it in, instant bitter.
Yeah.
And so it had the same same finished adjusted gravity, the same starting gravity, same alcohol level, the same hop flavor, the same hop aroma. It had the same bitterness, and it even had head retention. That was the part that surprised me.
Oh.
There was not a single grain of barley in it, and it had head retention.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I think it came from the hops.
For sure, it's something to pay attention on. So, what about Polish mead?
Polish?
Polish, like some experience from Poland, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, their classic recipes are ungodly strong. I mean, I forget the Polish terms for them, but some of them are like 1 part water, 1 part honey. Some, or maybe the weaker one might be 2 parts water and 1 part honey. But they're really huge, and they take years to ferment out. And when you can find them in a store around here, which is very rare, they're not cheap. They're packaged very nicely. They taste really good, but some of them have fruit in them. You can't recognize the fruit. They're just pleasant to drink in small quantities. If you have 15, 20 people over, it's about the right number for a bottle, because it's big and intense stuff. I mean, it's a lot of them. We're not talking a year or 2 years. We're talking many years of maturation. Many of them historically were done in wood, and there's a lot of microoxidation going on over all that time. There have been a handful of people that have tried to shortcut that for medaling in nationals by various tricky processes to make it taste the same.
Cool. So I think we have just 2 more questions now. Those are
Okay.
the final
Final.
Yeah. There's something about trying adding honey in a staggered addition.
Oh yeah, and people have done that. In part, I think that process probably goes back to before people knew how to add nutrients. So if you think back and you were trying to make mead repeatedly 100 or more years ago, you probably experienced the process that sometimes they didn't ferment out all the way well. And I tried around, and okay, well, if I only put part of the water in, and then 3 days, part of the honey in, and then 3 days later I add a little more and stir it, and 3 days more I add a little more, it tended to ferment better. And the idea of what's going on there is to avoid shocking the yeast too far. Because if you're making a really big sack mead, and that's where this is really going to matter, the massive sugar quantity in the must is very hard on the cell walls of the yeast. And there's a high risk that you're going to kill a lot of your yeast off, and then they're not going to finish the job. Well, we tend to avoid that by modern process, by rehydrating the dehydrated yeast with GoFirm, gets them really ready to work, and then we add nutrients over the next few days to keep them happy. And that's the alternative approach.
Yep. So actually for me, it's just the same. It's like if you control very well the fermentation, you have a good pitching rate, good oxygenation, it's gonna end and it's gonna be healthy.
Yeah, and it's going to be predictable. And, you know, even with the staggered honey additions, if you didn't add nutrients, you're still at risk that any, you know, what phase of the moon or whatever might shock your mead because you weren't giving the yeast any nutrients. I mean, honey doesn't have any vitamins in it by itself.
Cool. So, yep, the last one is actually a random question. It's just, we know that you like airplanes. So, what do you think about coronavirus hit the airlines, and now it's everything shut down?
Yeah, well, when I lived in Seattle, I worked for Boeing. That might give you a clue.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so Boeing shut down its factory.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure they also had some issues, you know, with sick employees.
Okay, so thanks, Steve, for all of your patience in the
You're
beginning
welcome.
and for staying so long. It was almost 2.5 hours since we started talking.
Well, it finally started working better. Of course, we're down to 21 people now.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that we can repeat this opportunity. Hopefully in the future we won't have as many technical issues. So
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I'm
know,
here if you want to try again some other time.
yeah, and a lot of people is in the chat just thanking you for this
Yeah, I'm seeing them fly
opportunity.
by here.
Okay, and yeah, so well, thank you again. It was a pleasure and an honor to be able to host this conversation, and for sure it was very knowledgeable, and I learned a lot of things, and I hope that a lot of persons did that as well.
Okay, great. We'll chat again later, maybe.
Yep. So, well, thanks again, and till the next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Muchas gracias, chicos, a todos los que se quedan y se conectaron el día de hoy. Steve, thank you very much for your time, for all of the information and the talk with Gustavo and all the people. Por el resto de la gente, nos vemos este día jueves, que tendremos la siguiente conversación, en este caso con Sirene Saborín. Estaremos conversando acerca de la somelería cervecera o el beer sommelier, y además de servicio, experiencias de servicio. Así que los esperamos el próximo jueves. Muchas gracias a todos.
Adiós.